I hope that the continued efforts to fight for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's justice and rights is something that we can all take a role in, and together we can achieve a stronger future. I'd like to also acknowledge anyone here who's from the Homeward Bound alumni organisation, relatives of producers who are here today, and introduce our panel to you to consider this film. So to my direct right is Jess Melvin Thomas. Please make her welcome. Jess is co-founder of Homeward Bound. She's current Tasmanian Australian of the Year and is a transdisciplinary researcher and knowledge broker with CSIRO's Oceans and Atmosphere. Next to her is MIBU FISCHER. Welcome. MIBU hails out of southeast Queensland from the Quanda Muka people and is a marine ethno-ecologist, which is a study looking at the interactions of oceans and cultures of the people relating to those oceans at CSIRO Oceans and Atmosphere as well. And then, needing not so much introduction after that film, is MEREDITH NASH, who is such an interesting mind and someone I've interviewed lots of times on lots and lots of topics, and getting to see her cry in the film was such a highlight. And I know you hate me for mentioning that. Her work is so important. She's Associate Professor of Sociology and Director of Inclusion, Diversity and Equity in the College of the Arts, Law and Education at the University of Tasmania, and as you may have noticed, a Homeward Bound participant. So this is our panel today, and I thought, you know, what would be really interesting is you've seen the film, you're smart people, let's not make the mistake they make on the film and tell you what to do too much. So I've got one question each for the panel. I have supplementary questions if we need them, but really this is your chance to ask questions of the panel. We do want to focus really on the next step after the film, as well as talking about but what really happened on there? So we will be looking forwards into the future of STEM. How does STEM address inclusivity? How does STEM address diversity? How does STEM open doors to a new space? Because I don't know about you, but when I watched this film, I thought, oh, this would be nice. And then I started to see this process fall apart in a struggle of this group of hardworking people who aged 7 to 11 decided to save the world and went into the discipline of science that then made it incredibly hard for them to stay in that discipline. And that story of people leaving thinking that it was their fault. And I think that for me was the sort of tragic narrative in the film alongside the very compelling narrative of the downfall of the guru. So we'll talk about it all, you know, it'll be great. So MEREDITH, let's start with you. Some of the stats there are really shocking. Less than 30% of Australia's science workforce are women, even fewer are women of colour or at the intersections of other social identities. What are the causal factors?
I mean, there are a range of barriers that we're familiar with in terms of women advancing in science. Most STEM fields are male-dominated, so that poses particular barriers for women to make it to leadership. Carrying responsibilities are an important part of women's managing their pathway in STEM. Navigating bias and discrimination. Women of color, for example, are not only navigating gender bias and discrimination, they're also navigating microaggressions in their everyday working life. So it's sort of, not only is it difficult to get promoted and to succeed, but also there's an additional layer of emotional labor that women are managing daily in STEM. It's sort of just like jumping hurdles, multiple hurdles every day that their male counterparts don't have to do.
And I think, just talking intersectionality then, the male counterparts don't even know that it exists often. How well are we getting those people to see that it's there?
Yeah, I mean, we could argue that it's invisible. But,
to them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, also, these barriers are very well known. We've talked about them for decades. It's hard to make the claim that people don't acknowledge them, but that actually, in order for people to really acknowledge them, I mean, it requires a level of vulnerability. Often people think that if they're going to have to sacrifice something if we make way for others to succeed. And so that's what allyship is about, that it's not just about me losing something, it's actually me trying to make a level playing field. So I think that's really where the conversation shifts. It's not about men losing out, but maybe it's about men in particular stepping back.
MIBU, in terms of you looking at this film and seeing what the women are struggling with, that question of diversity coming up and being raised, by Meredith, and that to go let's look who's in the room. What's your experience like in the field of STEM?
So on top of the barriers that Meredith talked about for women, being a woman of colour and also a white passing woman of colour, my barriers aren't as hard or difficult as my darker skinned sisters, but just that emotional and mental toll that we have to take with microaggressions daily in the workplace, as well as in our personal lives, we can't leave it. But I think also in terms of barriers, it's not just about our gender, it's about trying to find our identity as a person, and our identity isn't just linked to our gender, it's linked to our ethnicity or our cultural backgrounds. And for a lot of people who come from a settler colonial society, there's already barriers for that. There's massive gaps in our education standards for Indigenous people, particularly in Australia. And so that's a huge barrier that we have coming into the STEM field, just right there.
And as the leader on the leadership points out, correctly, is that you can't speak if you haven't understood those things for yourself and your identity. But one of the huge struggles we see in the film is between self-development versus structural change, Jess. And so as an organiser of this, how much is this leadership program starting to look at the structures?
I think in terms of structural change, Homeward Bound is obviously part of a much broader landscape, and this kind of wave of activity that's happening and helping to open up these conversations. And I think Homeward Bound was and continues to be significant, both in terms of opening up the conversations around diversity in STEM, but also the importance of diversity for addressing the climate crisis. And I think that's a really powerful element, an important central element of what, from my perspective, in co-founding the program, it was all about.
So let's talk a little bit more about that. What are we missing out on when there isn't diversity in scientific research?
Yeah, so I think that in terms of what we miss, we have good evidence that diverse teams in science deliver better outcomes. We also know that's true of leadership and governance, and in the context of climate change, we also know that we are absolutely going to need innovation, flexibility, acknowledging and embracing diverse perspectives to actually address these huge challenges. And so without creating space to bring in those voices, particularly in some of the more senior levels, I don't think we're going to have what it takes to overcome the challenges.
And maybe what are we missing out, particularly in Australia, without Indigenous perspectives?
We're missing out on a lot. So Indigenous science is a totally separate way of looking at the world, and it can only complement the Western science that we have. And so currently, without including that within our mitigation or adaptation strategies, particularly for climate change, we are behind the 8 ball, and we really need to start to embrace our cultural identity within Australia, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander science in that.
So we'll open the floor to questions in just a second. So get thinking, and I'll just chuck one more at Meredith. I'm watching the film and I see these people again who as children decided they were going to save the world and science was going to be the vehicle, and they were told you can do it, you can be anything you want. And then they're hitting the barriers and they're hitting the barriers. And just underneath the surface, as you watch people do the self-development, is this real anger. Does that need to come out more? Is that going to be helpful?
I'm trying to process what we mean by anger. I mean, what I appreciate about programs like Homeward Bound, or even certain leadership initiatives for women, is that they do radicalize people to a certain extent. That actually the reason that the research says that women's leadership programs work is because they provide a space for women to understand why it is that they're not succeeding in the way that they expected, that it helps them to confront gender bias and discrimination, that you can actually label the thing. You can label the brick wall that you keep hitting. It's not just you. I mean, that's the function of the leadership programs. And so if radicalization means anger at the first step, then sure. I mean, I'm happy with that. But the question is, you know, we can't let women sit with the anger that actually needs to be, the structures need to change. It's not women's problems. It's not up to the women to fix it. And that comes through loud and clear in the film. And, you know, that's part of the popular conversation now when we talk about STEM and barriers.
So questions now from the floor. And yes.
Yes.
If you stand up, it might be really helpful for us to hear. Thank you, if you're comfortable too.
Hello, I'm Cynthia. I work half of my time here in Tassie, half of my time in Argentina. And I had the chance to see the film twice in 2 days. And I can't stop thinking about, you know, the message of this film is this global movement of women trying to save the world some way. And there is nothing wrong with that. But the more you see, or the more I see this film, I see these white, privileged, developed country women trying to save the world. And I don't see, there is nothing wrong to be a white, privileged woman, but there is not global anything on that. And I feel sometimes this is the message that you give to the audience, and it's not real. And then I wonder if there is any perspective of doing, you know, the price of going to this program. Sometimes it's 3-year salaries, 4-year salaries in South American countries. I mean, if the program really is a goal to go globally, if there is any way to do it, or not, or the program is just for white privileged women.
So thank you, Cynthia. For the live stream who can't hear you, just Cynthia's question, working between Argentina and Australia, is the cost of this sort of program filtering to create access only for white privileged people and not asking or involving women from other countries, from other statuses of privilege to create these change? So Jess, Meredith, who wants to hit that first? Meredith.
This is for Jess.
Meredith takes it back to Jess. MIBU ducks. Jess takes the ball.
That is an absolutely valid point, and before we came into the theatre, we were discussing exactly that point. Again, it is a complicated problem, and one that the program is working to incorporate. But I think it's a broader question as well. That how do we make sure that in developing these movements around elevating the voices of women, we make it an equal playing field, because otherwise we're back to the same problem. And I do think, you know, part of that is that we need more conversations about what diversity actually means. I think that particularly if you're in that privileged seat, and I know that I am, there is so much to learn about what diversity means and how to actually bring true diversity of perspectives and people into processes. And I think, having stepped back somewhat from Homeward Bound, that I think that there's still much to learn as part of that program, but also just much more generally around how we can do that effectively and level the playing field. I don't know whether you guys want to answer that better than I did.
Maybe, I mean, you would have a perspective on this for sure.
Yeah. Yes. I just keep thinking of a book that I'm trying to currently read, and it's Talking Up to the White Woman, and it's about Indigenous feminism and how that looks very different to feminism in general, because it is kind of around that same idea of feminism or highlighting gender diversity is privileging mostly white women and not women of colour. And I don't know the answer on how to fix that, but it's definitely something that is noticed by myself and my colleagues, and it's talked about amongst us, and we kind of try and fight against that every single day in our job, and against the structures that we face not only as women but as Indigenous women in STEM, and it's really hard you have to try and pick your battles, and it's like, am I going to fight this as a woman, or am I going to fight this as an Indigenous person? And you are constantly having to try and make that decision.
Or am I going to submit my work? You know, I mean, you were talking about with social media, and if you put posts up around Black Lives Matter, for example, that you're committing a lot of time to that, being in that public space.
Yeah, it's a really big emotional and mental drain on it. So even the thought of having to raise the amount of money to go on the program is just like insane. It's absolutely insane. Yeah.
And as you say, Cynthia, that could be 3 or 4 years' salary in a different economy, which even here, I think the point was made that women were having cake sales and things, which, you know, other people would just get the professional development fund. Another question from the floor. Yes, at the back. Hi.
Sort of follow up one hard question with another.
That's what we're here for.
The elephant in the room for me with this film was that it seems to be about building leadership capacity for women from the bottom up. But the issue is that the people making leadership decisions right now, the ones who are hiring, the ones who are either intentionally or unintentionally putting barriers in place for women to get into leadership positions, are not on this program and are by and large not watching this film. And it seems like we're trying to, and it was touched on in the film a little bit, we are trying to put all the pressure of getting women into leadership on the women who are not currently in charge. And so my question is, to what extent do these programs miss the point in that the people in charge are the ones who actually need to hear this message?
Thank you. For our online audience, that question is saying training women to be the leaders of the future from the grassroots up has some qualities, but are some of the wrong people not getting this message who are the decision makers now? Is that a fair sort of ish interpretation? Right, Meredith, duck to the last one, straight to you. Here we go. What would this trip look like if the decision makers was there? Let's just go hypothetical on this with this really interesting question. If you were running the leadership for the leaders you want to change, your Dantner now, how's it going to run?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that we don't want to get the impression that, you know, women's leadership programs are the be-all and end-all. I mean, in order for it to be effective, it has to be part of a multi-level organizational strategy. It's just one small piece of trying to work towards inclusion and equity in, you know, STEM broadly or in a particular space. And I guess, you know, the onus isn't on women to break down the walls. The onus is on people in positions of privilege to make space. You know, this is what allyship is about. You know, particularly, you know, leadership in most industries across the world, you know, leaders of countries are men. They're old white men. And this is a problem if those men in positions of power aren't in a space in which they're stepping aside or amplifying the voices of people who are marginalized. So, I mean, to the kind of previous conversation we had, if your approach isn't intersectional and you're only focusing on a sort of singular source of social identity, then it doesn't work. That actually we need to think much more broadly about people and the way that they experience oppression in the workplace. And it's not just about gender. It can't just be about gender. If we're not thinking about race and ethnicity, if we're not thinking about sexuality, then we're not looking holistically at the problem of leadership.
And just to fit, that's what you mean by intersectionality when you say that. MIBU, so you've got like, I don't know how much has been raised for this program to finance it, but let's say, you know, $4 million for a program to take Australia's science leaders and to have an experience to change how they think and how they see this country. What would you want to see them do?
Oh, okay.
No pressure.
No. So I'm going to go off an experience that I had a few years ago with a senior executive at my organisation, and the personal stories that they heard in a week-long camping trip. and the change in them that they had, because it was personal. It became personal. The conversation in this particular instance was around race, and because they kind of got a better understanding of the disadvantages and marginalisation of those particular communities, they as a person changed. And so I think those type of experiences, if I could figure out what they would be, then...
You don't have to deliver the program now.
No,
it's okay. It's just like...
that's what I do.
Yeah. So that's so powerful. And you talked about there's things that you're blind to. Would that make a difference to you, those sorts of experiences as a leader now?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that, there's no substitute for just living it and seeing it, right? And having space to have the conversations. And, part of the Homeward Bound vision was making a really unique space to have conversations, and that worked in some ways and not in others. But I think we do need to think more flexibly about how we do that.
Such an interesting question, because so much of this film seemed to be about fixing the women, who then would fix the system so they could then save the world. Can they not just get on with saving the world? I come from an arts background. The amount of trouble scientists go to applying for funding's worse than the arts, and then the work gets lost. Another question from the floor. They're burning up the back there. Front row's struggling a bit, but up the back.
So I have a question more directly about the movie, and you mentioned before about how we need to have diversity in things like climate change research because of the importance of that diversity of voices. And I was wondering your thoughts on the way women's leadership was portrayed in this particular film, because I watched this and I felt a little bit depressed, to be honest, because I was hoping to see a movie that really showcased the potential of the women that are our future science leaders and their untapped capacity to make a difference to the world. And I guess it really upset me that the movie was kind of taken over by the drama rather than show those sorts of things. And I guess I was wondering your thoughts on that.
For our online audience, the question says that I came hoping to see examples of the untapped potential of women who could be the leaders who can change our future, and frustration that the film got hijacked by the drama story. And then the question following on from that is, do you find that frustrating in the context of this film? I mean, you're a co-founder of the program. You would have presumably been hoping this film would be like, that's what we all thought we were sitting down to, right? You're going to come out going, yeah!
Meredith is absolutely the star of the show, I think, in terms of the messaging. But I guess I have kind of two answers to that, Kirsty. The first is that I think from the Homeward Bound perspective, it's actually the power of the network and the group of women that are helping each other elevate their voices, but also kind of find many ways to show capacity and strength in science leadership. So I think that is happening. It just doesn't come through as clearly in the film, which I agree is a pity in some ways, but it's a different story, right? And I think the other point in terms of where we look to for examples of amazing female leadership, but also in science and more generally in the climate change context, there are in Hobart we're so lucky to have some wonderful examples of that, and then also we are seeing, I think through the pandemic crisis as well, amazing examples of female leadership and the kind of changes that can make. So I think there is another question around how do we make that more visible and keep having that conversation, but there are plenty of examples to look to.
It would be real nice if there's a part 2 where we saw the good facilitators come on, right, and learn maybe how they run those sessions. MIBU, just talking while we're on global leadership, just to throw that open, and also our online audience, just a reminder, you can write in questions as well and they'll get to me via my SMS, so do send them in. We've seen some examples of global leadership in New Zealand. Jacinda Ardern is a really interesting example. We've struggled to hold those women up in public life in Australia, for sure. But it's who are the people you look to? Who are those strong figures for you? Either in political life or in Australian life?
Well, there's not very many. So that's an issue in itself. But recently we saw in Victoria, Lydia became the first Aboriginal Greens senator, so that was great. And so there's some women in politics that are coming through, but in terms of the STEM field, I didn't have anyone to look up to growing up. Yeah, so I've had to find them along the way, and I'm actually really lucky that in my team there's 5 Indigenous women in my team, and so we have each other, so we kind of, I guess I look to them, yeah, and we help each other in regards to that. But I think it's really important in having people to look up to that you can associate, just like you can see yourself in, and I didn't have that, and a lot of young women of colour don't have that. And so it's really difficult sometimes to answer that question, because I have been asked that a lot, who was your role model or similar things, and it's like they didn't exist, or if they did, I didn't know that they were Indigenous. So yeah.
Yes.
Hi, thank you all of you. I'm really grateful for you coming and sharing your experiences, and I got a lot out of seeing this tonight. I think it's interesting, have different perspective from the previous question, which I guess speaks to the film's theme a little bit, that when you have a bunch of people in the room, we're all going to have different ideas and take different things away from tonight. But I actually found the challenging of Fabian to be one of the most important things to see in this film, and I think that themes run through most of these questions, and how you actually challenge existing leaders and have those conversations. And you know, there's language around the pale male and stale old white guys. It's pretty uncomfortable. Like, this, people are a product of their experience. Fabian's a product of her experience, and it's pretty amazing for her to say at the end and reflect and be able to step up and say, yeah, I was wrong. Obviously that didn't really happen at the time, but huge respect to all of you who stepped up and actually challenged her. Is that something that's been, I guess, a skill set or a discussion that's been incorporated into the subsequent voyages? Because, yeah, it's absolutely something that I've found like really challenging as a young female scientist, and even, yeah, standing up for yourself and saying, you know, I want to ask for more, I want to be ambitious. That's the really hard thing, and I think that's where you see change. But challenging people is tricky.
So the question for our online audience is that for this scientist, seeing the leader be challenged was a really important part of the film. It's something that's very frightening to do. No one teaches you the skill set. So what's the skill set? Why do you feel compelled to stand up? Do you feel frightened? How do you make yourself brave? How have you learned to do this?
Because I'm a feminist with a capital F.
You can clap that, like, we have fun. Don't be polite. I think that's part of it, though actually a desire to be polite can also be important. So, but what does that mean?
It was lonely. It was very lonely. And I really, you know, it's interesting. It's an evolution. I can't speak to what's happening on current, you know, more recent voyages, because I'm not involved in the program in any substantial way. But I mean, I have to say, that was coming from a social science background, doing gender studies my whole life, identifying as a feminist publicly. Being on that ship, I felt like some women around me were only just having a kind of feminist awakening. We're almost scared to say the word. And so for a long time, I was like this real radical rabble rouser, you know, which none of that seemed too radical to me. But I was sort of I felt very alone in my critique. And I'm pleased to see that the evolution of the program means, you know, leaders are talking more about diversity, that the women who are participating in the program are actively trying to, you know, build on what happened in the first voyage and trying to improve how the program works. I mean, that's really satisfying to see, but it was definitely, that was a different experience for me.
When you speak up to power, though, how important, for example, I mean, we talked about having a voice as a scientist before, Jess. If you don't have the right data, how important it is, do you feel, that you can speak about what you've seen and perceived?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really important question, and will become increasingly challenging as, you know, I know I keep coming back to climate change, but I think that's an important example of where, to some degree, you know, scientists have set themselves their own wall beyond which they may not step to talk about the issue and bring their own perspectives. And we must only ever make assessments in a particular, very structured way that actually then makes it very difficult for people to know what we're talking about and relate to it. And so, I think that is a really important question, and it comes back in the context of that question too to the importance of diversity in terms of, Meredith brought a really different perspective to that first voyage and was brave enough to speak up about it. But if she wasn't there, it may not have been said in the same way. So there may not have been the same degree of change. So we need that diversity too to get change.
And that is a real thing in the film, isn't it? That she talks about people needing to be uncomfortable to change, but gee, how uncomfortable did she have to become before change was possible? And the courage that it takes to question a system. Especially in the context, and let's talk about this maybe, of the sexual harassment that then emerged on the boat. So, abuse and harassment are silencing tools. They're tools that push people out of the centre to the sides. One of the reasons women leave science is as a result of that. Was that a shock when that came out? When you found that video?
I mean, maybe it shouldn't have been a shock. I mean, it was the time. We weren't expecting to have someone record a video where they disclosed abuse. But, I mean, if you look at the broader statistics, I mean, it's so common in STEM. Women in STEM experience more harassment than any other field. Women of color experience the most hostile work environment of any group. So it shouldn't be shocking that harassment happens. But I think, the compelling aspect of the film is that, the context of that program it was supposed to be a safe space in which women were developing their capacities and enjoying the company of each other. And you shouldn't expect that would happen there, but it did. And it just, that's the soul-destroying, heartbreaking part of that story, is that not only did it happen more than once, but that some of the women weren't believed. And that's unforgivable.
Any more questions from the floor? Yes, up the back.
Hi, thanks all. It's been really clear and it's been just honestly fascinating. I think my big question is, it's all about, leadership and this individualism. But, if we're going to have any kind of change, it's about working together. And you're talking about loneliness, Meredith, and maybe you're talking about not having role models and how women get isolated and how women need to a lot of the time align with men and say, I'm not like them, I'm making space, and how do we actually move forward together without having that kind of competitiveness or having to, align yourself with something that might necessarily be for the collective.
Thank you so much. The question is saying that the film is looking at, and science is individualistic and people are made to be lonely, but how much do we need to work as a collective, find other ways of working with consensus? Is that a fair-ish summary of that? I think it's raised as well by the Chinese woman to say, well, we actually think in a community way. So this whole individualistic thing is just exclusionary immediately, and I think Indigenous communities often experience that too. And there's that guy in the film, isn't there, who's like, oh yeah, it's very competitive. What's wrong with the structures in science, Jess, publish or perish, with the biggest psychopath who does the longest hours wins model?
Yeah. I think there are two particular problems that come to mind. One is that I wonder if there is an emerging misconception that publish or perish actually is still expected, and that for career advancement you have to follow a particular model when in fact the system is more flexible than I think particularly women realise it is, and so there's an element there of building networks and finding the confidence to actually navigate that system in a different way, and that we need to make that happen, that we can recognise scientific impact in other ways apart from just a heap of publications in Science and Nature. So I think that's really fundamental, and I absolutely agree that we shouldn't have this this vision of a senior leader working all hours of the day and not having any time for family, and there is still an expectation that if you get to the top you're going to have to live like that, and it just shouldn't be like that.
And if you want it enough, you'll make that sacrifice.
Yeah.
I mean, the culture where you only win if you stand above the parapet, if your experience every time you stand above the parapet is to be abused and harassed, you have no chance to hold that space. And if you come from a community where standing out can attract shame, for people who don't understand that concept, and that was also in the Chinese community, how could we do science differently, better? Or how does that affect you when you're thinking about wanting to succeed in that way? To stand out?
Yeah, I think it's just an extra personal barrier that you have to overcome in realising if you want to work in this space and in the system that exists in academia, then you have to push yourself outside of your comfort zone, out of what is culturally normal for you or for me, and be that person sticking out above. And it's really, really difficult, and I think for me in particular it's easier because I have a really good relationship with the other 4 women in my team. So we kind of, for us, there's 5 of us, so we're kind of our own little community, and so we can in some ways reduce that level of shame that we feel because we're all supporting each other in that way. And I think the more that those types of communities are encouraged and developed across science, then the better. Like, that will be for everyone. Yeah, but it is difficult coming from a different cultural background and growing up with different worldview in terms of everything's communal or holistic. And so just that whole idea around individualism is a strange concept, and it's one that I'm personally trying to change in the science that I do and the way that I work. And I think if more scientists can work like that, then it's only going to be better for everybody involved, and we are going to get away from this publish or perish type of environment.
And the future of science is transdisciplinary, it's communicative, it's interconnected. Meredith, what's your take on this question, the idea that we're operating within a model that favours the individual, that's so masculine? Because I'm real comfortable in that. That sounds real nice to me. I can do that. It's my birthright. How do we change it?
Yeah, I mean, well, like, the problem with that model is that we're in the place that we are, where people in underrepresented groups are forced to do the work of inclusion and equity. If you're a person of color, you're marginalized, or you're a woman, or you're LGBTIQ, it's your job to fight for your rights in the workplace because you're part of that particular group. When actually, again, I think it comes back to allyship. Equity and inclusion that's everybody's work. That's everybody's job. It's not up to the Indigenous scientist to make her workplace less racist. It's not up to her to do that. It's up to me as a white person in a position of privilege to use my privilege in a way that not only amplifies the voices of other people who may not be heard in the same way, but to use my power and influence, if I'm in a position of leadership, to ensure that I'm changing the structures that are marginalizing people I'm working with.
When you talk about making space, I mean, some men hear that and they're like, fine, I'll quit then. Is that what you mean? Take my cricket bat.
No, I mean, if you think about the sort of the spectrum in which organizations travel in order to get to equity, which is sort of this place in which we're at meritocracy, where an organization can identify that people are oppressed in this particular organization, and we are acknowledging the fact that people are oppressed differently, and that this is not a level playing field, but we're changing our structures in order to fix that. But also, people are comfortable to step aside so that the leadership itself in a particular organization actually reflects the diversity of the workforce. That, it's not just hollow words about we value diversity, inclusion, and equity, but that actually, and we're not just sticking more diverse people in the pipeline, but that we are actually showing that we value diverse perspectives and that we are including those perspectives in the way that we are running the organization. And that is the fundamental difference from just sort of where most organizations start to where they ideally want to end up in the long term, but people just don't have the stamina.
And you can put people with diverse voices on boards immediately. They don't have to be in the industry for 50 years to give a perspective, eh? Like, yes. Oh, from the front.
Yes. We're saying that publish or perish is a barrier to leadership or even participating in science and STEM. If we are not going to use publish or perish, how do you suggest could be another way of establishing that you are a leader or an expert in a particular field?
This is a question saying, if we don't use publish or perish as the measure, what are the other ways of recognising excellence in the field and rigour in the field? Jess?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question because credibility will always be an important part of being a scientist. And so, but I think we can absolutely be more flexible with, you know, what we require in terms of, or expect in terms of demonstrating credibility. And then there's the question around, you know, scientific impact, and we have a model that scientific impact equals pump out a whole lot of papers that hopefully someone will read and say, isn't that person a wonderful scientist? And, you know, not only is that just a weird model, but it actually isn't going to fix the big problems in the world anymore. And so credibility can become much more about the kind of work that MIBU does, which is about working with communities or stakeholders to understand what questions they need answered, and then working with them to deliver the science that will actually help them start to fix the problems. And then the whole process is credible rather than just the individual. So I think that's what really needs to change.
Maybe can you talk a bit about that work? Because that's a way, isn't it, of getting voices who aren't even in science or privileged. So you're not going, oh, well, in 60 years there'll be a bunch of Aboriginal scientists and they'll ask the questions. You're doing it now. So what does that look like?
Yeah, it's I'm trying to think what I do now. It's very much the same process as science. So you go into a community, you develop a really good relationship with them. It takes a long time to develop that trust, and I'm saying that as an Indigenous person myself. I can't just go into any community and automatically get that trust. But it is the same process, and that's the similarities between Indigenous worldviews and science, or Western worldviews, and the way that the science is done is you're still asking questions and you're still developing answers, but it's just the methods that you do that aren't recorded in the Western system, they're recorded orally. And so for me and the work I do, it gets a bit tricky because then it comes down to IP. And I don't actually have the rights to publish that information because it's not my knowledge. And so the credibility in terms of that, it comes down to how the work is implemented and the impacts that has to the community, and not the impacts that I'm imposing from a Western science perspective, the impacts that the community have identified what they want. And there's plenty of communities out there who want to be involved in science, want questions answered. It's just scientists being brave and creating the space for these questions to be put out there into the world. Yeah.
I mean, if you're talking about exhibiting intellectual rigour, like that's an effort.
Yeah.
That's a huge intellectual effort, but we don't have a system really to recognise that, or in fact value it just with like money, which is one really good way to do it. Lots and lots of money. Do you have a perspective on this question as well?
I have lots of perspectives, because I think that one of them, particularly in the context of women building their capacities to lead, I think often women are under the misperception that in order to be a leader, they need to be in a role. You need to be called a director or some kind of executive, or you have to have some title. And I think that, at least for me personally, one of the lessons I learned, I thought that as like an early career researcher, I need to get a particular title in my context. And then I worked out that actually, none of these titles, these roles fit me. I just need to make my own. So I just found ways to navigate a system in which I could create leadership roles for myself. And even if it didn't look like the traditional picture of leadership that I had in my head, I worked out a way by talking to mentors, by talking to other more senior academics, for example. I found a way to find a place for myself. And I mean, that was huge for me. I don't have to, if you look at me, I've got tattoos and I don't wear a suit. And I don't look like, when you picture an academic, it's not me. But I had to find a way to make a place for myself. And that was like a light bulb moment.
And what's exciting now is lots of people who look like you can now picture themselves as academics. That's leadership.
I don't know, can they?
This is your space, and you not let them in. You crush them on the way up. Because yes, we all recognise those leaders. I think we have time for like one more question, maybe two at the most. Is that right? I'm not quite sure exactly where we started. Are you guys all right? Are you travelling okay? Because it's interesting. Yes. Hi. Yeah.
I was curious to hear your thoughts on the specialty of going to Antarctica for this initiative.
The question is, what are your thoughts on how special it is? Is that right, to go to Antarctica?
Going to Antarctica for this sort of, why
yeah. Why is it important? Why is Antarctica important? Maybe Jess.
So the original Fabian vision of why Antarctica, and I think that it was a while since I actually watched the film, but I think the story of the dream is in there, right? That is partly around the importance of Antarctica in the global climate change story. It's partly around what Antarctica represents more generally in terms of connection of people to natural environments. It was partly a really unique space to do something fundamentally different. It was partly linking to the experiences of female scientists in Antarctica, and finally it was just like, it looked, she knew it was going to look amazing, right? And it looks amazing in the film, and it looked amazing in all the pictures that we had in the media around the first voyage, and I think that was a clever thought, because people could identify what Homeward Bound was, because it was in this incredible, beautiful ice setting. And so I don't know if that actually answers what you were asking, which may have been more complex than I just answered, but they were the motivations. I think that's all of them, right, Meredith?
Yeah, but also, I suppose, when we talk about climate crisis, we think about Antarctica as a primary site to, can witness it. And, but also, from a social cultural perspective, in the context of this program in the film, Antarctica has this deep masculine history. When you think about Antarctic exploration, you think about these brave men battling the blizzard. And women were excluded mostly from Antarctic exploration for much of history. They mostly went down south as partners and wives. And women weren't able to do land-based field work until the 1980s. In the Australian Antarctic program and in several other national Antarctic programs. So, there is something quite special to think about, this sort of, again, this incursion of women learning about leadership and sort of building this collective empowerment in a place that is so deeply associated with men and masculinity.
And one more question.
You talk about STEM, and there's been a concentration on science, but there's technology, engineering, medicine, and
mathematics.
What were the takeaways for? We talked about publish and perish, but what were the takeaways for those people that weren't in the science field, but were in those other areas? And how did they get over that? The equivalence of a publish or perish in those other fields, or what did they learn about themselves to be able to move beyond that in a leadership sense?
So the question is saying that it wasn't just science, it was technology, engineering, maths, and medicine, what were some of the things that people from those fields shared or revealed on the journey? You were there. Meredith.
I mean, I actually think their journeys are quite similar. I mean, I can't speak to the micro level sort of nuances between the disciplines, but I mean, in many of those fields, you know, most of the women on the program in that first iteration were academic STEM people, practitioners. There was a relatively smaller proportion of women working in industry. But, you know, if you think about things like, it's not just publish or perish, but if you think about something like promotion, I mean, that affects all people in the majority of professional careers. So, I mean, there was a lot of shared commonalities of experience around barriers and what leadership looks like when you are in that setting, in the context of that program. So,
yeah. And Jess, I mean, subsequent journeys, have you had a greater mix of those people or people in industry, and are they still sharing the same experiences? I mean, I think field work must be another area that's similar.
Yeah, I was actually going to make a comment from the other angle, which was more around very early on formulating who we thought, you know, would even be able to apply to go on a homeward bound voyage in terms of background, and we decided early that it was women with a background in science, so it didn't have to be women who were currently in a STEM field. And so even on the first voyage there were a mix of women who were no longer actually working in STEM, that were, for instance, working in policy, but that had a background in science. And I think that was really important in bringing in some of these other stories we've talked about around why women might move out of science into another area, and or, you know, how that links to what is kind of given higher value in terms of a career pathway, and I believe that's still part of the conversation.
So can I finish with one more question about one of the really chilling statistic, one of many in this, is the number of women we lose from science. That graph, you know, with that crossover point, and then off they go. How would the industry, I might start with you, you're training, I know. If you look forward through your life and what you hope from your life and how you would like it to go, what would the industry look like to keep you? It's a tricky question. And if you want more time to think.
Yeah, can I please have more time?
Yeah, absolutely. So Meredith, then I'll go to you with that question. How do we not lose women, and how do we not have them leave thinking it's their fault?
I mean, on some level, I think the solution is sort of simple. We don't have a problem of getting women into the pipeline. We've got plenty of women and other various groups into the pipeline. The problem is that we don't have adequate infrastructure or supports to keep them there. So even though it seems easy to keep doing initiatives about getting girls interested in STEM, the fact is girls are already interested in STEM. What are we doing about the mid-career women, for example, who are in these toxic workplaces where they are experiencing microaggressions or harassment, or they're trying to, you know, they're carrying responsibilities that make a sort of typical work, you know, 38-hour work week impossible to manage and to juggle. And so all becomes too hard. And I suppose, you know, theoretically, you know, STEM is this, science is supposed to be this rational, very objective discipline in which everybody succeeds in the same way. It's meritocratic. You just have to be smart to get ahead, when actually, you know, when we talk about identity politics, it poses a big problem for STEM, because if we start to talk about people's oppression, then that illusion of meritocracy and objectivity no longer applies.
I think actually to receive funding, statistically, it's best to be called David. And that group of people received the most funding than anyone else put together. I think that's still accurate. Jess?
Or Andrew or Tony. I
think.
Yeah,
Andrew. Andrew's right up there. So if you're having kids, think it through. No, what do you think? What does it look like? What is your, you know, science look like? What does engineering mathematics look like where we don't lose this talent?
I think Meredith has nailed it, and there's a bunch of really practical things that are already starting to happen that we could do more of. But it's about just, you know, really naming up the issues and strong action to address them, I think.
Yeah, you're happy with that?
I'm happy with that.
Cool. Great. Thank you so much for your questions, for your attention, and your time. I'm sure the panel will stick around if you're someone who likes to ask questions face to face. Yeah, just we hadn't talked about that before. I don't want to commute things because some people don't like to speak out in a group, and that's normal. So yeah, it was an honour to be part of the conversation. So thank you for asking me to be here today as well, and also with our online audience, which was all brought to you by Inspiring Tasmania. This film opens now at the States, so the filmmakers would love you to talk it up, of course, and get people here. And it's such an interesting film, isn't it, in so many ways, and certainly way more thought-provoking and troubling than I expected it to be. So yeah, I got so much out of it. I got so much from your questions. So if you'd like to join me in thanking our panelists as well, Jess, for being here. And the State Cinema for having us here. So,